Okay.
Very straight hair.
Okay, everybody. Hello. Thank you so much for coming out today, because I know it's in the middle of school and classes. It's lovely that you've come to join us. So welcome to this event that is organized by the Center for African Studies at SOAS. I have to say something about the center. And it was founded in 1956. But since 1991, it's really assumed this role of coordinating, stimulating, promoting research and discussions on Africa. And today's discussion is one such event. So today we have the former Development Bank Senior Vice President, Swazi Tshabalala. Is it okay? And in conversation with Stephen Chan, who is Professor of International Relations and author of African Political Thought and Intellectual History, The Quest for Freedom. And Swazi is the only woman vying for the position of presidency for the African Development Bank. So congratulations for that. Well done. Well done. So today's discussion will explore various themes, I believe, including innovative financing, right, sovereign debt, issues with the IMF, and other topics as well. Welcome. So Stephen Chan, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. No, thanks for coming, everybody, and thank you for coming. So as I said, we'll make sure this gets a big audience in terms of our YouTube channel. But you were Senior Vice President for 3 years and 1 month, I think.
Yes.
And you resigned in October last year from the African Development Bank. That created quite a stir.
I noticed.
And then when just very recently, last month, you announced your candidacy to be the president of the African Development Bank, that created a stir as well. Did you intend to do that, or did you just decide at the last minute to do it, or was it a long thought out strategy that one day you would apply to be the president?
So it's very interesting. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for being here. So it's interesting because obviously as Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank, you see a lot of things, you see a lot of challenges, you see a lot of opportunities, but if you're not president of the bank, it's very difficult to actually implement those changes, that you had in mind. So when South Africa decided, because it's actually countries that nominate people to when South Africa decided that they would like to put me forward, I wasn't upset. Actually, I was very happy because I thought maybe, some of these ideas that I have, I'll have the opportunity to implement. So yes, it did cause a stir. I'm not sure why. To be quite honest, I don't know why. It could be that, maybe it's considered a bold move by a woman. I have no idea.
Well, none of the other candidates caused a stir. Maybe they think you really are going to be the implementer of change. But my friends in Zambia have also nominated a very good candidate.
Yes.
So the first thing I was concerned about was, will this divide the SADC vote? Because block votes are going to be quite important in the final election. Are you in any way in contact with the Zambians or any of the other candidates?
So I know Samuel, obviously as before I became Senior Vice President, I was the CFO, Vice President of Finance for the African Development Bank. And we used to work very closely with Anshula, who is the CFO of the World Bank. And she would organize a meeting of all the CFOs of all the MDBs, and Sam was the chief of staff for Anshula. So I've known him there for quite a while. We've never really worked directly together. Amadou Hott worked with me at the African Development Bank for maybe about 2 years. So I know him a lot better than I know Samuel. The other candidates, Dr. Sidi of Badea, I also know him. I'd run into him, especially at the AIF. But the other candidates, I don't know, the one from Chad in particular. So my view is that these are people that I respect. They have their own accomplishments. And, something to remember is that everybody talks about the voting bloc of the regional economic communities. The reality is that it's countries, it's member countries who vote in their individual capacity. So where, yes, it's nice to get an endorsement from a regional economic community, but in the end, the decision will be made on who is considered the best candidate.
Okay. And if you were successful, you'd be joining a whole float of female presidents of banks. Europe, for instance,
Yep.
and the World Bank.
Yep.
The list is getting quite extensive now. This is basically the start of a new recognition that women have a special contribution to make, just in terms of conceptualizing the problems of finance and financing, because of the way that they have to live, the condition of women in Africa and elsewhere in the world. You'll bring a special unknown to the job that hasn't been there before. This is going to be a huge challenge. Will you get much male objection to any of the ideas that you're going to bring?
Listen, at Prophet, my age, and I've been in senior positions in many different organizations, I know how to deal with male objection. And it's certainly not going to stop me from, pursuing this opportunity. And I think what women bring to these types of roles is a fresh, new perspective. I always tell people that for me, this campaign is personal in a way. I'm an African candidate who doesn't hold a passport for any other country. So where for me it is personal, it's about the development of my continent, the continent where I will retire, the continent where I will be there. So where it's very, very important to me that I do what I can.
Okay, well, look, let's talk about what you can do. I'm going to come on to the question of what you can do for young women. But in terms of approaching that particular question, just today or yesterday, the African Development Bank, in concert with Standard Chartered in South Africa, came to an agreement to fund small and medium enterprises. Seemed to be a major step forward. But what I was wondering was, can you go one step beyond that in terms of true innovation that affects the youth and young women as part of that? I worked in the 70s with the Malaysian government when they established what they called the Youth and Business Program. The Minister of Youth then later rose to become very briefly Prime Minister because he'd made his mark with youth and business, which is basically taking informal businesses, street businesses run by young people, educating the same young people in business practice, formal business practice, then giving them grants. Now, this is obviously very, very risk heavy, but it worked. So the Malaysian economy was able to build itself from the bottom up, rather than the top down, which many financial schemes tend to do. What is your view about really innovative, radical, and risky financing of that sort involving young people? What would you try to do through the bank to elevate the position of young people right now, usually at the bottom of the heap?
So this is a multifaceted problem, I think, in Africa. So first of all, I think the deal was with Standard Bank and not Standard Chartered Bank. Yes. So where these are all efforts we've done, previously similar deals for women entrepreneurs. The bank has announced the Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks, which is a very elaborate sounding, term for really helping young people build businesses. That's effectively what it is. But what are the constraints that, young people in Africa uniquely face? So financing is just one of those constraints. The other constraint is skills, as you recognize, they need a lot of help with the skills. But the other constraint they face is basically the lack of infrastructure in Africa. So I'll give you an example. South Africa went through a period where electricity was very difficult, to to be had, and there were young people with businesses, for instance, selling ice cream, who didn't have the money to go and invest in backup electricity. Probably were not thinking. They're young people, right? They have an idea. They've got these great new flavors, and they want to start a business. So they don't, I guess at that age, and at that stage in your business, even if you have the, wherewithal to consider all the risks, you actually don't have the financial capacity to be able to address them. So it's very, very important, I think, and really, which is at the heart of my campaign, that we address this infrastructure issue, because it is a huge constraint. Because obviously all of those young people, I made one example, but I'm sure there are others, would have been discouraged, by something like this, and probably would have lost the money of family and friends. So it's important that we understand that our intervention has to go beyond just saying they need money. They need a lot more than that. And I think that it is possible to work with institutions, because people also forget MDBs are very big, and we're not very good with dealing with one young person as a business. So we need partners. It's very, very important that we have partners who understand young people, that we consult young people, because this is the other thing MDBs do. They'll sit there, they'll do their research, they'll write their papers and tell everybody how it should be done, instead of talking to the potential beneficiaries, of that investment. So these are all the approaches. So there's nothing new, right, in development in a way. If you think about it, it's really what's new is how we do things. And I do think that, the need for greater consultation with the beneficiaries, the potential beneficiaries of our investments is crucial.
Absolutely right. Would you have young people on your boards and committees? I ask because I work for a number of homeless charities here. We always have people who are very recently homeless sitting on our boards. So we don't feel that we're being do-gooders without any real knowledge of what it's like on the street. So will you involve the young people in your decision-making, President?
Yeah, obviously the bank itself has young people. There's a youth, program that, I think they've taken about 30 young professionals, every year. It's easy to think that these are young professionals who still have to grow and learn from us. But I think it's a lost opportunity, personally, because we forget that we also have something that we can learn from them. And so it's really about, first of all, leveraging what's inside the organization. I mean, I've worked with some of the most talented people I've ever worked with in these organizations. It's leveraging that capacity, especially from the young professionals, and bringing that in. In terms of the board, actually, I'm speaking at an event tomorrow here in London about boards in general. And one of the things that, we talk about the fact that a lot of boards don't have women. Just to start there, and I think increasingly we need to think about, especially in the context of Africa, where young people are going to be a big part of the population. How about you bring them into some role in large organizations where really a lot of the solutions are for them, even if it's not immediately, but certainly in the medium term.
Yeah, that's very, very heartening and reassuring. What about young people, including very much young women, who are particularly hazardous and dangerous situations, like in countries recovering from war? What are you going to do in terms of diplomatic assistance? Young people who are trying, as part of their country, to recover from terrible catastrophe. How hard it is for those countries to recover, that they provide some kind of infrastructural context for young people to be able to develop themselves. And what you have is not only more than half the continent being very, very young, but of those half the population, almost half of them come from a very, very disadvantaged background, either economically or in terms of violence in the communities. Is there going to be a special outreach, even though it's not financial terms immediately beneficial? You've got to get a return on your liquidity lendings, for instance.
Actually, MDBs have a different model for financing development. We're not focused on returns. So this is important to emphasize. The bank funds itself in order to be able to cover its costs. So we're not a traditional financing institution in that respect. Secondly, we have shareholders. All the African countries are shareholders in the bank, but we also have 27 countries from outside Africa who are shareholders. And they, from time to time, will approve a strategy for the bank and basically ask that resources be directed, to that strategy. And the bank has an overall mandate, which is financing the development of Africa. Now, if you look at that mandate alone, you can tell that it's potentially a very broad mandate. But part of what I would really like to bring back in the way development is done is a little bit more selectivity. It's a little bit more selectivity because part of the problem that we've had is that we've tried to do so many different things in so many different areas that our impact is marginal. But if we were to focus our energies, for instance, in the development of infrastructure, which is it's a huge constraint. Terrorism thrives in the darkness, right? You're in an area with no access to electricity. What do you expect, right? How can jobs be created for young people? So for me, this is a priority. If you don't address this infrastructure grant, then there's already work being done between the African Development Bank and the World Bank with Mission 300 to give access to electricity to 300 million Africans. There's 600 million of them without access to electricity. These are important. If you want to address health better or improve health outcomes, you need electricity. If you want to have increases in agricultural productivity, you need electricity. So it's for me, it's it sounds impersonal to say this when there are people involved, but if you think about the consequences of this investment in infrastructure to those outcomes, really meaningful development outcomes for women, for children, for young people, that infrastructure, that core infrastructure is crucial.
But this infrastructure, I mean, life for the citizens of Mogadishu in Somalia was transformed, and the Chinese brought in hundreds of street lamps that were financed by solar power during the day. You didn't have to have generation of electricity to provide for the citizens of Mogadishu. And suddenly life was transformed. People felt safe to be able to go out at nighttime, lead a normal life. How much thinking out of the box will you be able to do? Will you come up against entrenched interests in the infrastructure business?
No, in fact, I mean, I think, part of what I bring is the willingness to challenge those interests. It's possible to, first of all, be a lot more ambitious in terms of connecting Africans to electricity. For instance, if you think of power grids that are not necessarily connected to the national, power grid, you can actually accelerate, connectivity. If you think of solutions that can be driven either by the private sector or even by communities, all of a sudden you can do more, by providing basic support. So that's exactly, I must be clear, I do not believe that MDBs have all the answers. They don't. And let's be quite honest about that. And that success will come from partnerships, and that's partnerships with the beneficiaries and partnerships with the number. I mean, there's over 100 regional development banks in Africa. Why don't we work with them and maybe massify the impact that we have by collaborating?
And with the private sector, but I think in an imaginative way, it's still on the table at Diageo. This is the drinks manufacturer, Guinness, Johnny Walker, all that kind of drink. I was working with the chief executive There's going to be a pilot project which should be village-based. Every village gets a solar powered electricity generation unit, together with X number of hundred cell phones and iPads. So these things can be recharged. Each iPad will be loaded down with at least 100 books. You don't have to donate library books in hard copy anymore. It's so hard to transport them. Instantly, you've transformed the educational prospects, the communication prospects of an entire village community. That's reaching down. It involves the young people, benefits them, involves public-private partnership. But that also means you're getting involved with big companies that want to have publicity. And not everyone, particularly in, say, let us say, in an Islamic country, would want to have one of the world's biggest drinks manufacturers located, even if they're doing good work in the community. A whole range of problems that the bank and others have to confront to do this.
I mean, I see them as, also the thing we talk about Africa, as if it's this monolithic place with the same values, each of these countries have their own character. So one of the advantages I think that the African Development Bank has is having presence on the ground. And generally, these are people who are Africans, have worked in Africa, and they understand the environment, which is very, very important. So I think that as long as we understand that, in certain countries, the approaches will be different, and, we are prepared to accommodate those differences, I think that we can still be effective. Some solutions, I guess, are capable of being applied, in a consolidated fashion to as many, countries as possible, and some are not. So where there is a certain amount of flexibility, that's required, even as you talk about, for instance, regional trade. Africa has the lowest percentage of, regional trade. If you try tomorrow and create an EU in Africa, it's not going to be possible. But if you take the approach that actually Africa has got these regional economic communities that already have put in efforts in the last 20, 30, 40 years to try and resolve some of the issues to deeply integrate trade, why not focus on those? And then it's a much simpler thing to try and then, integrate those regional economic communities, to increase the percentage of intra-regional trade.
Well, certainly the regional economic communities. But what about also in macro terms? So you have a twin track, regional and continental. What kind of working relationship would you hope to have with the Economic Commission for Africa, for instance?
So UNECA, is already, I think, deeply embedded in some of these questions. They participate in the summit of the African Union. The African Development Bank works closely with them on development issues. And they also work very well with OuldTah. Actually, it's very interesting because UNECA was initially created actually to drive economic development in Africa. Until, of course, there's a question about now that OuldTah is actually created and exists, do you really need UNECA to continue? But my argument would be absolutely you do, because OuldTah is a new organization, it needs support, we need to continue working together. And of course, the more hands focused on Africa's development, the better. So, so I think that, as far as I'm concerned, Africa has, the issue that always troubles me is that from time to time there'll be these huge, initiatives to save Africa, right? And everybody will pretend as if these problems are new and they need new solutions, instead of actually saying that, recognizing that these problems have existed for a long time, and maybe what we need to be thinking about is how to better execute the solutions we've already come up with.
Yeah, that's very, very reassuring. And again, bottom up, the people involved. So what about financing institutions that are not directly African? What are the funds that emanate from BRICS group, for instance, largely Chinese financed funds, sometimes up to 50 billion at a time in terms of capital input? How do you deal with them? The turmoil in the G20 right now impacts on a lot of possible developmental work and cooperation. In other words, you would become president at the time when the world is going through its most volatile period for decade after decade. And you're going to be very much directly involved in this volatility is going to affect development and financing throughout the continent, whether we like it or not. You know, the wiping out of American aid, for instance, being only one case.
It's actually interesting. I mean, I see this as the culmination of an evolution that really started with the financial crisis in 2008. You know, if you think about it, it sort of accelerated around the time of COVID, you know, and it's just continued to, you know, get, I guess, more complex as time goes by. And, you know, so I think it's important to understand the context. I mean, the issue of development aid, we know that for the last, I think it's 15, 20 years, development aid has been declining. I mean, that's the reality. You know, people complain about, you know, Chinese funding of projects. Well, you know, if what were the countries supposed to do? If, you know, traditional ODA is declining over a period of time, you have to think about, you know, other options. And then I think in terms of my own personal experience, I actually became acting senior vice president on the day that COVID was declared a pandemic. So I have some idea about dealing with really, really stressful times. So where, you know, I'm comfortable with the fact that the world is going through a rapidly changing period. And, you know, we have to be open to doing things, you know, differently. I mean, I think what I bring different from my competitors perhaps is that I haven't spent my entire life in development. So I look at it differently. You know, I don't look at it as, oh, we've always done these things this way, you know, and therefore if something changes, you know, we're in a pickle and there's nothing we can do about it. And then also, I think on the BRICS issue, people don't realize that it's only Russia in BRICS that's not a member of the African Development Bank. So, you know, China is a huge contributor to, you know, to the African Development Bank and Africa's development. The Africa Growing Together Fund, for instance, is a massive fund that, you know, has financed a lot of projects. That's a fund that is managed by the African Development Bank. So, so it's only Russia that's not a member. And then if you look at the BRICS Plus, obviously all the African countries are already members of the African Development Bank, and countries like Turkey, for instance, are a member of the African Development Bank. So I honestly don't think that there is as much discord as one would believe. I mean, they're on the board of directors, on the board of governors, they work together, they collaborate. It's simply, you know, a question that there might be a lot more noise about it, but I think cool heads in the end will be able to, you know, actually make that kind of membership, which is diverse, which comes with different perspectives and different views, a strong advantage.
Okay, let's deal with one big macro problem. Then I want to give members of the audience a chance to ask their own questions. I can see they've been following very, very closely your ambition for the bank and your leadership. But the bank still makes liquidity available to member countries, and you're owed a lot of money by various members of the bank. Right now, the Zimbabweans have just started very preliminary negotiations to restructure their debt, a lot of which is owed to you. I was involved with the Zambians, when they went through their protracted restructuring of their debt, again, we were involved in that. Other countries, the whole question of liquidity becomes something which is of urgent concern to almost every single region in Africa. Are there going to be any outreach programs to try to put forward to African ministries of finance and decision makers how to finance development without necessarily going into such deep debt? In other words, does there have to be a paradigm change in the way that finance is secured and approached in many parts of Africa? And can the bank play a role in this paradigm change?
So it's interesting. Let's think a little bit about this debt problem, because I think it has to be approached from two different angles. So in the first instance, imagine yourself, you're a minister of finance in a low interest rate environment, and you go out and you borrow in capital markets. The investors are happy to have you. The financing, looks reasonable. Your ability to actually refinance when the bond matures still looks reasonable at the time. And then you have a pandemic. And then you have all this liquidity, which is, beyond your control, by the way, as a small, let's say middle income or lower middle income country to control. All this liquidity flooding the market, causing inflation, and then the tightening that follows that then drives up interest rates. The reason I'm painting that picture, because it's important to understand that, some of the debt issues in Africa are not necessarily because ministers are irresponsible or they don't understand how to manage debt. And I think that's why it's important that this is a global, conversation about when you have decisions like that, quantitative easing or whatever, it was called at the time. How do international organizations come together and sit and say, okay, there will be consequences for this. How are we going to deal with these consequences, right? And part of the discussions around the international financial architecture are designed to address those types of things exactly. So that's the sort of like external, beyond the control of African finance ministers. On the other side, though, I do think that, we need to think about, improving, public finance, public debt management in countries. It's very important. But in addition to that, also how we, really think about asset and liability management as ministers of finance, because, while I argue that a lot of it was things not in their control, the fact of the matter is that it becomes their problem. So really thinking about these issues is very, very important. And the bank obviously is in a position to support them as they think through those issues, support them with obviously capacity building, but in addition to that, with very specific support about extending the maturity, for instance, maturity profile of their debt, and helping them hedge the currency exposures.
No, I'm very reassured. One of the things I did for the Zambians, I opened talks with one of the bond creditors in the bond market, BlackRock. I've never gotten such heartless, hard people in my life. And that's saying something. No sentimentality, no idealism. They just wanted their money back. Thank you very, very much. So a very great deal of advisory capacity would have to be involved with helping ministries and ministers dealing with people like that. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that all of you have got questions that you want to ask the prospective president of the Development Bank. Would you like to raise your hands and feel free to ask any questions that you might have of her?
One of my questions is about if you want to make Africa is better, the thing is they have something to export. I mean to the world. But what I see, they don't really have like a definite policy to do, to bring like the local manufacturer, to the world. Because I have seen the training for the young entrepreneur is really sufficient, because I was living in South Africa before during my high school time. They do have one program called the Junior Achievement. They ask those big fours bank in South Africa to how to pick some the students from different schools to run a big business. That's very successful. But the thing is how we can transform. Like the local manufacturer. Can bring to to the global.
Yeah. Okay. Should I respond?
Yes, please,
Okay.
please.
Thank you very much, for that question and the observation. So it's very important to understand that, again, the problems are different in each country. So I don't know if you've heard of this terminology called middle income trap. These middle income countries that need to find a new way, to drive, development. They are not considered poor countries. They have the basic, infrastructure, but they seem unable to move beyond, being an industrialized economy or a mining economy to maybe an economy that encourages services or small manufacturing, because they have the industrial, base. But they are also, have to deal with competition, right? The fact is that I don't know of many countries in Africa that can produce steel competitively. So if you think about it, if you have to import the inputs, make something, and then try and export, you are unlikely to be, competitive. However, I do think that the continental free trade area in Africa does represent an opportunity, and this is what we need to look at very, very specifically, for young people. Young people in other countries face, they may want to start a business, that could industrialize, but they don't have access to infrastructure. So the problems are different, and that's why, I would honestly advocate for a regional approach to trying to address some of these challenges.
Just a short follow-up question. The idea of the free trade area, does it like the EU's one? Because that's one of the pillars of the free trade area in Europe, that is the free movement of the people.
Exactly.
But now, that is like, even in South Africa, they do have the problem of the unemployment.
Yeah.
So they have like these xenophobic movement. In last couple of the year, they don't want other immigrants from Africa to come into South Africa, because they think they are going to take away their jobs.
Yeah. So I think you're right. In order to integrate trade in Africa, you have to look at the free movement of people. You need, certain skills need to move to certain opportunities. They ought to be able to do that. So where I think that African countries are making progress. The African Development Bank publishes the Africa Visa Openness Index as a start. And I know that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat is working on some of these issues, where you have to have a certain level of movement of people in order to encourage free trade. So I think that different countries approach the problem differently, and I always encourage people to look at the policy making as opposed to social reaction, because I think it's very easy to think that how people react to a particular problem, which could be triggered by nothing that has to do with what we are talking about today, can then end up, I guess, badly characterizing something which is actually a very good thing. Yeah.
How are you? Very much for that. I'm good. Yeah, in terms of infrastructure, I think that's a really, really fundamental, area as well. What I tend to find is the fact that I know you mentioned there's like 24 shareholders in the bank, something like that. You got 24 shareholders?
No, there's 54 African
54,
shareholders
sorry.
and 27 in
27.
non-African
Or
shareholders.
24 out of Africa, did you say?
27.
27,
Yeah.
sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
So all these entities obviously have different interests.
Yeah.
So you do have the Power Africa, which was sponsored by the USAID, I believe. So what I see is that you have different sort of like entities sort of implementing the same projects in terms of infrastructure, because the AfDB will be doing something and the World Bank would be doing the same thing with another, you know, sort of like organization within the company or governmental department. Is there a better way for all these projects to be coordinated so it could sort of prove more effective that, you know, in terms of implementing them?
So it's actually, thank you very much for that question, because I think it's and of course you understand a little bit how you know, the organization works. I do think that it's a area of weakness and an area of opportunity. I said that I couldn't believe it. I attended the Finance in Common Summit in Cape Town, which took place about 2 weeks ago, and got this Bible, huge document of all of these regional development organizations. I'm talking about regional development finance. So countries have financed, you know, particular development institutions to pursue development objectives, perhaps in a certain sector, etc. And there are over 100 on the continent, all of them doing their own thing. Imagine if all of us could come together with OuldTah NEPAD to actually plan and prioritize together and deploy, because each of us has capital, right? We may, you know, African Development Bank may have the biggest amount of capital, but all of these other organizations and development finance institutions have capital as well. Imagine if we deploy that capital in unison. Imagine if we could approach partners in unison, you know, so that we don't disperse efforts, but we actually try and maximize impact, implement transformational projects. And by definition, I think those projects would be regional projects. They wouldn't be country projects, because you would have all of these, you know, partners that you are working in. I think that, you know, this is an important, you know, issue. You know, there obviously, I think there are institutions the bank works with, as you know, AfriExim, Africa 50, but there are many, many more. That's the point. There are many, many more. And I think that there's the opportunity, you know, for really accelerating investment in infrastructure.
And finally, sorry, I know all these different aid organizations and international donors have got their interest. How can we, or people like yourself, the organizations, be able to sort of consolidate those interests to make sure they're directed towards the benefit of the African people, because they all got sort of dispersed interest, and obviously which creates a chaotic sort of atmosphere as well.
So, you know, there's a guiding star in the mandate of the African Development Bank, and that's Africa's development, right? So anything we do has to be with that objective in mind. So yes, people will come with their different priorities, with their different, you know, I won't go into it, but climate is one such area, right? So where, you know, but if we have a rational discussion about what Africa needs, the challenges that Africa faces, and what we can do to help Africa, you know. In climate, for instance, Africa, really mitigation is not the issue. Very small emissions, 3-4%, okay? However, adaptation is a huge issue, okay? Because now we can see the effects of climate change. So that means that from an African policymaker's point of view, it simply doesn't make sense to say, I'm going to use fossil fuels because I've got them, and, you know, damn the consequences. It makes no sense, because the consequences will be on your own people, okay? But at the same time, you can't say that we're going to industrialize Africa relying entirely on wind and sun and all of these kinds of things, because then your energy security, which is required to actually industrialize the continent, will be a challenge. There's a balance there that works. And that's what we need to do, instead of people saying, oh, my country, this and what, it's not interesting to me. My interest is, how do we balance these challenges intelligently and in such a way that it advances the mandate of Africans?
Time for one last question. People who've not yet had the floor, ladies.
If not, I'll ask one more.
The
Last
lady,
one. Great, sorry.
The ladies, I want to hear from the ladies.
We've got the only female candidate for the presidency, so we need to have a SOAS representative of the women here to say something or ask something.
I think it should be a student. Natalia, did you have any question? Or
A bit shy, yeah.
She said no, but I think you have a question.
Not really a strong question. It's okay. You said that the African situation in terms of the financial sector is like mostly regional. So when I heard that, I thought that the African environment for like economics and finances is quite niche or quite special. How do you incorporate ideas such as free trade that are typically, European ideas into the African continent and your approaches to economics?
Oh, that's amazing. She said it's a small question.
what?
That's an extremely deep question, and Professor, you made it to help me. You have a very bright student who just asked a very complicated question.
Well, you must make her your intern right away.
Indeed, she needs to come on board. But thank you very much for that very good question. The honest answer is that I don't have an answer, but we can talk about it, because I think that it's, I don't know if I would describe the, financing of development in Africa as niche. And maybe that's been the problem, that it is seen as something which is unique and different and, specialized, instead of, looking at it as financing anything. Yeah? I mean, infrastructure financing is a global endeavor. And it's really about saying, how do we make those opportunities in Africa global in that sense? There's a lot of work that's going on right now to try and get global institutional investors, for instance, interested in African finance. But I think for me, the key is involving the private sector. Because again, if you leave, this kind of pursuit of infrastructure in Africa to merely the MDBs or, governments working alone, it's unlikely to be structured in such a way that it attracts private sector financing. Because I can tell you this about private sector financing, they are not interested in tying up capital for unproductive ends. So this is the thing that we need to consider. I mean, capital, for instance, MDBs approve projects, and then, 5 years later, these projects haven't dispersed. No private sector will ever do that. They would not tie up their capital for 5 years, waiting for something to happen. So these are the kinds of things, and I think that's why we need to co-create these solutions, with the private sector. And I think what's unique about what I bring is the fact that I've had a lot of private sector, experience, and I understand what the private sector needs. Sorry, just to pitch for myself.
Well, a pretty good 1 hour pitch, don't you think, ladies and gentlemen? Busy day, she's taken some time out to keep this as your own. So thank you for your contribution. And now, Anita, close down the shop, as it were.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for coming today. We've learned so much. Thank you very much.
Well, the next president of the African Development Bank.
Yes.